afternoon, everybody. As Mitch said, my name is Meg, and I will be presenting on the topic of misplaced shepherds, a ministry meant to help yet structurally altered from its intended purpose. I want to tell you a bit of a story. There is a youth pastor who sits in his office one day doing the regular office work. A youth from his ministry comes into his office asking for an opportunity to talk with him. Of course, he welcomes this student in with open arms and a willing ear. The student sits down and begins to talk, but he says something the pastor's not quite prepared for. I think I might be gay. Now, this pastor believes scripture, loves Jesus, and loves the student, but he freezes. Unfortunately, conversations like these are statistically inevitable, with a study by Pew done showing that 76% of LGBTQ adults under 30 came out before the age of 18. And of the Gen Z population, 20% identify somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. To understand why the youth pastor freezes, though, we have to zoom out. And this leads to the central research question of this study. Why are conservative evangelical youth pastors unequipped to holistically minister to LGBT youth? Now, there are three assumptions that go along with this project that I have done. The first is that it takes a conservative evangelical and biblical stance. Second is that it holds a holistic view of personhoods as laid out in Proverbs 22. And third, it's focused on the role of youth pastor leadership. Where did this problem come from? Now, this issue is not an issue of theological conservatism or lack of compassion, but a structural misalignment within youth ministry that isolates youth pastors from parents and fails to provide centralized, theologically consistent resources for navigating identity formation in a postmodern culture. Let's get some context to this. Of culture today, 23% of the population is Gen Z. One shocking thing about this generation is that it is the most individualistic culture in history. There are three main proponents to this: individualism, psychological self, and sexualizing the self. Individualism emphasizes personal growth over social obligation. It says that the self is over everything. It presupposes logic, reason, laws, even ethics. It says, be true to yourself. Identity is self-created, and feelings define truth. The psychological self says you are what you think you are. Romanticism focuses on emotion, imagination, and personal experience, emphasizing self-expression and introspection. While some might think this could lead to freedom, to maximize personal satisfaction, data has been suggesting otherwise. Gallup in 2025 reported that only 20% of Americans are actually satisfied with their lives, which is in contradiction to what psychological self teaches. And then third, the sexualizing the self. It's not just how you choose to live, but now at the core of who you are. There is a shift and a movement coming in from behavior-based language, such as same-sex attraction, to identity-based categories. It's no longer the how, it's at the core of the who of us. Now, as stated earlier in the assumptions, this project was taken from a conservative and biblical worldview. So let's compare the cultural anthropology to the biblical anthropology. The cultural anthropology says individualism, but biblical anthropology teaches community. While modern culture often defines the self through inward feelings and sexual expression, Scripture offers a radically different view by saying that the human person, as created in the image of God, is embodied and relational, set to thrive within community. Now, this community is called koinonia in the Greek, which calls us to set aside our desires and to live in shared life with others, under God's design specifically. Augustine said in The City of God, the earthly city is characterized by love of self. The city of God is characterized by love of God, and all true community flows from this divine orientation. He was emphasizing the point that believers are not meant to live isolated individual lives pursuing their own goals. They are called to be part of the mission of God, and their goal is to love and serve others. Now, this does not mean that they should think less of themselves, but simply think of themselves less. In opposition to the psychological self, we have the spiritual self. Unlike the psychological self, which is shaped by inner feelings, The spiritual self is rooted in imago Dei. This is the image of God. Modern perspectives often separate identity into parts, body versus feeling, inner self versus outer self, but the Bible presents them as a unified whole. True fulfillment comes not from autonomy, but through holiness. The Christian view of self is teleological, meaning it is focused on design and purpose, specific. The self is not truly itself until it is oriented toward God in right relationship with Him. Finally, sexualizing the self to holistic creation. If the spirit is the metronome of the self, then the body is the instrument, playing according to the rhythm set by the metronome. Culture reduces selfhood to desires, but Christianity roots selfhood in holiness. The self is primarily shaped by worship and love, not sexual orientation. Scripture teaches that sexuality is a gift meant to be respected according to God's design. Male and female, He created them. It is stated in Genesis. God created us to be multidimensional: body, soul, mind, will, and heart. Now, there are obviously some tensions that are caused by these opposing worldviews, and these incompatibilities are escalating and creating gaps that are widening into chasms, casting conservative evangelical churches in a negative light and ostracizing them from culture more than ever before. There are three main approaches that have come out of these tensions. The first is accommodation. The accommodation approach accepts culture's categories, making it more available to how people want to live their own lives as defined by them. Second is the withdrawal approach, the complete opposite end of the spectrum. It pulls away from culture, which results in disengagement or irrelevance, which only adds to the tension. And third, the third approach is biblical discipleship, maintaining theological truth while practicing radical love and holistic care. Each is valid, but a gap still needs to be addressed. How could these tensions be prevented from arising in the first place? Enter the rise of youth ministry. The Sunday school movement began in the early 18th century, and they were started as an effort to combat educational poverty among working class children, with child labor laws and compulsory education now becoming a norm, while also offering biblical instruction as a continuation of family discipleship. Then, in a post-war climate, we have the teen subculture arising. With teenagers now recognized as a distinct social group, churches were motivated to develop intentional ministries specifically for them. Sociologists started discussing teen culture as its own category, defined by music, fashion, and even rebellion. Youth groups became common practices in local churches, combining Bible teaching, social activities, service opportunities, and places such as Young Life, Youth for Christ, and InterVarsity Christian Fellowship were born during this time. Adults and parents saw this culture as a way, they saw youth groups as a way to be a defense against rising secularization, such as Elvis, rock and roll, things of that culture of the time. Which leads us to the programmatic era of contemporary ministry. Churches were influenced by the broader seeker-sensitive movement, such as Willow Creek and Saddleback, aimed to make Christianity appealing to teenagers by adopting methods that reflected popular culture. Youth groups increasingly focused on large events, concert-style worship, lock-ins, and retreats, all designed to attract and retain young people's attention. However, despite all of these efforts, researchers in the early 2000s proved and shown consistently that between 60 to 80% of church-going teens still drifted away from faith in their young adult years. They recognized that we had built youth ministry to attract teenagers, but not to disciple identity. Center in 2010 said that youth ministry became more about activities and events than about teaching youth to live faithfully before God. There are many instances in which youth pastors feel out of their depth. The leadership gap here is that they're not prepared. One youth group realized that a third of their students identified as LGBTQ. Yet, the youth pastor, Nathan, was completely unequipped to respond. He noted that while some LGBTQ students were specifically in his group and realm of influence, their parents did not know. and neither did he nor they have any idea on how to guide them and support them through the questions and quandaries that they had. The church lacked clarity on teaching of its own sexual ethic, leaving Nathan in a gray zone, especially when students' convictions diverged from their parents. Since youth pastors feel unequipped in this area of ministry, they do not discuss it. And the assumed silence, especially around sexuality, has contributed to the perception that the church either cannot or will not support youth who experience same-sex desires. Now, we stated this as a question earlier, but now with context and data, we can make this statement that conservative evangelical youth pastors are unequipped to holistically minister to LGBT youth. So what solutions have we tried? There are three main ones that came up in my research. The first was the integration model. This was born from the effects of the silo effect. This is an entertainment-driven, age-segregated youth ministry that isolates young people from the very community of faith that they need the most. In his book, Sticky Faith, DeVries argues that youth faith struggles were tied to isolation from the broader church body, and that for holistic well-being to become the norm in youth environments, they needed to be intertwined with a multi-generational influence. Now, the strengths of this model came in the fact that there were intergenerational discipleships. And this brought a huge emphasis in belonging to a larger church body, focusing on spiritual growth, as according to biblical teachings. Its weaknesses lied in that it was not specific enough, as there was little to no cultural literacy training for LGBT youth, and this could possibly lead to silence or stigma. The second model is the equipping model. Another solution that's being presented is further specified trainings for conservative evangelical youth pastors so that they may be better equipped with resources and knowledge on this ever-growing issue. Two very shocking statistics that I found was of the majority of institutions and seminaries, only 28% of them had LGBTQ courses. And of that 28%, only 17% required a sexual ethics course. There have been some initiatives who have tried to address this, such as Fuller Youth Institute and parachurch training workshops. The strengths of this are the youth pastors are more equipped to engage and handle difficult situations, also raising awareness of the issue, and their confidence is instilled with them to have better conversations. Its weaknesses lie in inconsistent program training, as not all programs would be built the same, which also is a lack of opportunity for youth pastors due to time, funds, or support where they are at, which then feeds into isolation of youth pastors, which again goes against effective church community. The third model is the family model. Now, programs like Access Ministry, Focus on the Family, and Fuller Institute have shifted their focus from relying predominantly on youth pastors to empowering parents to have ongoing Christ-centered conversations. This strengthens family bonds, which reduces isolations in youth and counters the silo effect that we mentioned in the integration model. The weaknesses of this model, however, lie in that not all parents are spiritually mature. Many Christian parents feel unprepared to discuss sexuality with their children. This leads to them being overwhelmed, and then parents reverting to youth pastors to teach the youth, which then feeds the vicious cycles of youth pastors still being unprepared and overwhelmed themselves. Gilson said in 2005, parents often avoid addressing tough subjects such as homosexuality because they fear saying the wrong thing and feel inadequate to explain what they themselves believe. Now to my personal solution, a collaborative approach to ministry. We have already stated two different facts. The role of youth pastors have become inflated and unsustainable. And two, parents are meant to be the ones ministering to their youth. Therefore, I am proposing a two-part redefining and supporting system. The first part is redefining the role of youth pastor altogether. We need to shift from having the youth pastor be the primary spiritual authority for teens, the identity crisis responder, the isolated specialist, and transitioning the role to a parent equipper, someone who is a facilitator of theological conversations, someone who is a cultural literacy trainer and resource curator. More clearly, the youth pastor needs to go from the primary teacher and minister of the hearts of youth to a support minister and resource for parents to have specific conversations with their youth. Parents become the primary minister, as they have the most availability to talk with their youth and then seek also youth pastor for guidance. This has biblical support in Deuteronomy 6, Ephesians 4:12, that talks about equipping saints, and again in Proverbs 22:6. However, for a youth pastor to be a good resource to parents, they also themselves have to have access to good resources. The second part of my proposal is a centralized theological resource hub. Now, phase one would be a digital platform, a website or app where conservative evangelical youth pastors can log in and find curated categories. It would create a comprehensive resource network with parent guides, discussion prompts, recommended readings, podcasts, and videos. This would integrate academic and ministry research for a streamlined and stable information portal that is accessible to all. Phase two would be a printed companion. This would be a physical resource book or binder version for churches or similar congregants without a strong digital infrastructure. But of course, in order to have such a resource, there would need to be training with it. With a resource library in place, churches can have comprehensive trainings on how to use it and have their congregants how to as well. Youth pastors and leaders in the church in general could receive a brief orientation module via video or a one-day workshop on how to use the hub. Then, being empowered themselves, they can go into their churches and teach parents how to use this resource and how to model it at home. The feedback portals within the hub itself would allow youth pastors and parents to suggest additions, ensuring that the web stays relevant and updated with what the church is facing today. Now, the purpose of this is to eliminate fragmentation, as there are many sources out there on this topic. However, they are scattered everywhere and can be very hard to pull together. It would also ensure doctrinal consistency and provide practical conversation tools that can be used. The structural outcome was that the youth pastor is no longer isolated, as they are in right positioning to what is biblically correct. Parents are empowered and church leadership is aligned. Now, this isn't all finished. The question then comes of what comes next. While this study was limited to literature synthesis, future research should employ mixed methods or longitudinal approaches to test outcomes such as youth retention, parental engagement, and leadership development across multiple church contexts. It should also be looked into of what it would look like to create a team to build such a resource, how to market it, advertise it, and get it out into the conservative evangelical youth spaces. These are one small thing of my references. I had 13 pages, so this is all we got today, but thank you.